Thank you for joining for our Beautify and Care for Your Stream or Lakeside Property webinar. My name is Nikki Wolf and I'm the Education Program Manager at King Conservation District. This presentation is being hosted by King Conservation District. And for those of you unfamiliar with King Conservation District, we're a unique type of government agency. So we're a special purpose district. We're non-regulatory, non-enforcement, and we serve kind of a special role helping private land managers manage the natural resources on their property. So it looks a little bit different depending where you're at in King County. We have some urban, suburban, rural areas, forested, farmland, and shoreline areas. So we'll cover a little bit about mostly our shoreline projects today. And KCD really helps people by kind of a three-tiered approach. So attending webinars or workshops like this, we provide education. We also have some planners that can go out to your property and offer technical assistance if you're in different types of property areas. And then we have some financial incentives and cost share funding and other programs and services that I'll mention throughout. So today we're really going to go over the importance of lakes, streams, rivers, and wetlands and why we want to care for these areas. We'll talk about urban and suburban areas and how there can be specific impacts on the waterways from these types of areas. And then really we'll dive in and spend most of the time talking about riparian restoration and how to improve the health of Pacific Northwest waterways while also having a beautiful area. So let's talk some more about some of these water features. So the first one we'll talk about is streams. And streams are really important to our landscapes in the Pacific Northwest, and they have three primary functions. So they're helping to move water along. And along with that, they're transporting sediment and then also providing habitat for fish and wildlife. We have some beautiful wetlands. This was actually taken by Marin, who's our helper on the call in Bellevue. Wetlands are a really unique feature and they do a great job acting as a sponge. So you can think about some of those heavy rainfall events. This is an area that can absorb and soak up some of that rainfall. It also filters out a lot of pollutants. So it's holding the water and filtering the water as well. And then it's a niche habitat for a lot of our different plant and animal species. And then we don't have many people on lakes here, but this is a picture of Lake Leota in Woodinville. And so we're saying if you live on a small lake or a large lake, it can really help, lakes can really ease the impacts of flooding and drought by storing a large amount of water. So you can think the quantity of water stored in a lake. And it can help infiltrate some of the groundwater in and also provide great habitat. So let's just think a little bit about how our area has changed over time. I've lived here for about 8 years. My husband and mother-in-law have lived here their entire lives. So even thinking about over your time living here, what has happened to the area. And so thinking about, the more natural setting, from forested areas, like a lot of our natural forested areas, they have about 10% of the water that's coming down in rain that runs off into our surface water systems. Whereas we've had more urbanization happen, we're up to about 55% in these urban areas that's running off from these rain events as well. So that can really drastically impact our waterways over time as we see these higher levels of runoff, and we're getting more pollutants and sediments that are getting carried into our streams, lakes, and eventually Puget Sound. And then just kind of a special note too, I know a question we get a lot is like, well, I have lawn and that's, the grass is a plant too. But something kind of interesting about lawns is that water that falls on the lawn typically only moves within that top 4 to 8 inches of soil, and it can actually pick up a lot of phosphorus and specifically phosphates and transport that into the water bodies within the watershed. And when I was first learning about this, I thought like phosphorus, oh, that's just when I have applied fertilizer. But something really interesting is that there's actually a lot of phosphorus in the organic matter, such as like the leaves and grass clippings, and then also pet waste or other soaps that might get onto the water or onto the lawn. So really like lawns, whether they're fertilized or not, can generate more phosphorus per year than our forested areas or even landscaped settings. So let's just look. We're using Renton as one of our examples, but people really have made a lot of changes to our streams and water bodies over time. So this is a great aerial shot of Renton from 1936. And you can kind of see some of the different forested areas here, especially when we compare it to an aerial shot from 2017, you can see the difference in the number of roads and houses. And there's a lot more impermeable surfaces. So think of those as the areas where when water hits it, it's going to run off. It doesn't get a chance to infiltrate into the groundwater. So in a natural system, our waterways have clean, clear, cool water. So that happens, there's lower temperatures, higher amounts of dissolved oxygen, and then less pollution. And there's a much higher presence of aquatic organisms. And a lot of these streams aren't channelized, so they're able to, meander and flow, and there's a lot more large woody debris, like downed trees, and complexity. And a lot of these areas have buffers of plants. So the area right next to the creek, I know we have somebody from Longfellow here, and this is a photo from Longfellow Creek in West Seattle. So we're looking kind of at that buffer area next to the creek, and that's called a riparian zone. So it's that area, right from the water, right adjacent to the water, and it's pretty distinct from our more upland areas. So this is a really, really crucial area because it's helping shade the stream. And like we said, in the natural setting, we really want that cool, clean water. It's also acting as a buffer from what's happening in our landscape to what's getting into the water system. So as we have those rain events, it's slowing down the water, both by stopping it as it drops, and then any surface flow. It's gonna just provide kind of that barrier of defense. It's also providing leaf litter. So it's a really important component of our food chain is leaf litter. So it's the base food chain for aquatic organisms. So in a natural setting, our shorelines have roots, which are kind of our natural erosion control, slope stabilizers, and they're really even better than engineered structures because they get stronger over time and can adapt. And the root depth and complexity is one of the advantages of using native plants in your yard. So we have kind of a this, not that image here of invasive plants versus the native alternative. And you can just look below in that brown area at the different root depths and complexity. So if we're looking at butterfly bush versus Douglas spirea, yes, there are some root systems, but there's not the same quantity of roots. So those native plants are going to do a much better job holding in our soils. And that's really important, especially as you live along a creek or a wetland or river. So another big benefit of having a vegetated buffer along the shoreline area is improved wildlife habitat for many species. So we have a lot of beautiful birds and mammals, amphibians, insects in our area. So providing them with a good habitat space is important. Another big benefit is our improved salmon habitat by having these riparian areas. So juvenile Chinook salmon, which is our endangered species, they actually rear in the lakes for several months before they migrate out to sea. And they typically follow the shoreline and need that shallow, complex habitat for refuge. So the different aquatic vegetation growing in these areas can help provide that habitat in the nearshore areas. And something kind of interesting, salmons actually avoid swimming under docks when they migrate out to the ocean. So that's been studied. And they usually go around the docks into the open, deeper water, which is great habitat for the predatory fish that like to eat all the little baby salmon. So overall, we want to improve water quality too by adding shade. So you can kind of see in here, we have some diffuse shade. That's really important for keeping cooler water temperatures. So as you can think on a shady day, our creeks also want some shade on those really sunny days to help keep them nice and cool. And so vegetation also acts as a filter. So it's going to filter out any of those excess nutrients or pollutants. So that can include fertilizer or dog waste or different pesticides. And dog waste in our area is really a leading cause of bacterial contamination in our streams, which can be a human health hazard. And an interesting fact is that a single gram of dog waste, so about a pea-sized amount, can contain 23 million fecal coliform bacteria, which is just crazy. And dog waste can also carry roundworms and giardia that can sicken people if consumed. And then if not cleaned up, some waste can last in your yard as long as 4 years. which can be a health hazard for kids who play outside or people that are gardening as well. So if the dog waste washes down our storm drains and ends up in our rivers or lakes, it can be a human health hazard. So this is more for this, we see this a lot more on lakeside properties, but a big benefit of having kind of a vegetated buffer too is less goose poop. So geese really like those wide open areas of lawn, and they tend to avoid the tall vegetation because that's it's harder for them to detect predators in those areas. So our streams, lakes, and wetlands are really a beautiful and quintessential part of the Pacific Northwest ecosystem. So if you live along one of these waterways, you have a unique opportunity to protect these special places and act kind of as that last line of defense against some of the pressures by planting plants that provide habitat and shade and do all the water filtration and slowing down that we've talked about. So we can do this through what we call riparian restoration. So restoring those areas right next to the water bodies. And the goal is really to go from this to something more like this, where we've planted some plants and watching them grow, and they're just starting to get established, and long-term having some forested areas. So now we'll kind of shift into our Restoration 101, and we'll go through kind of the 5 main steps that we follow when we're planning a restoration project. And so this is really the best approach to protect and maintain our restoration areas to have healthy native vegetation on your property. So we'll dive into step 1 of our Restoration 101, which is really invasive plant removal and control. So the first step is to determine which species you have and you're dealing with, and then figuring out what are the best removal techniques. And the removal techniques really need to be site-specific and location-driven. So we'll provide some overall techniques and touch on some of the common species we see in a lot of our urban areas. But it's really best to use, when you're thinking of which methods to use, using a little bit of everything. So we really want to integrate methodologies here, because there isn't just one right way to manage weeds. It often takes different methods, time, trial, and then patience. So let's dive into how we remove some different removal techniques. So the first one is manual removal, and it's exactly as it sounds. Like we see here, people are digging out some English ivy. So this is where you're using hand tools and muscle to really remove some of the ivy, digging out blackberry roots, unwinding and peeling morning glory vines away from a tree. Mechanical can include, cutting, mowing, brush cutting, grading, and crushing. And this one's really all about starving the roots out over time. And it can be really effective. And the goal is to mow and remove the leaves that are creating that sugar storage, and then starving the roots out. And it can be less invasive sometimes than actually like digging out some of the roots, particularly if you live on a steep slope and you don't want to disturb the soil. And just a note too, with mechanical, some cities have rules against using power tools in this critical area right next to the water body. So you'll definitely want to look into your local rules and regulations for critical areas. So another technique, sheet mulching and weed control fabric are all really about suppression of weeds. And it's typically used with a lot of invasive grasses too. So I know we had some people write in, they have reed canary grass. We'll do this when we're like planting into that area and trying to establish shade. So there's really pros and cons to each of these, but it can, work well if you're planting into the area. And then chemical control is often a last resort, but can be a really valuable tool to have in your toolbox when you're battling especially aggressive weeds. Like in the picture here, we have the cane of Japanese knotweed. But if there's a risk of any sort of herbicide drifting into your local water body, you should really work with a professional with an aquatic approved applicator's license. And this is best to use as a last resort, and it's the smallest quantity you need to get the job done because there are consequences of this. So working with a professional and then following the King County best management practice sheet from the Noxious Weeds program will kind of tell you what can be an effective solution for your weed. Yeah, and then shade is really a long-term defense against weeds in our area. So, we have some reed canary grass picture here, and then some trees that we've planted that are trying to get established over time. And so shade will eventually help shade out some of those invasives. So now we'll go through a few of our common invasive weeds and talk about them. So English ivy. I know I see this all the time in a lot of our areas, and it looks like we had a lot of people here that are battling some English ivy. Um, and it's a really, really invasive vine that can grow along the ground or actually vertically up trees. And when it grows vertically, that's where it's going to reproduce and produce berries. And it can add weight to trees and really take over our forested areas. So our first biggest concern with ivy removal is creating a survival ring for our trees if it starts to grow up. So we do that by starting about 5 feet up and cutting all the trees around, or cutting all the vines around the base of the tree and pulling those away. We don't want to actually pull any of the vines out from the top of the tree because that can be really dangerous as they've like wrapped into some of the branches. But yeah, we'll pull 5 feet down and then a 10-foot diameter all around the tree. We want to clear all of those ivy vines away. And then for managing ground ivy, you can do that either by like manually pulling or bundling, or if you have one kind of monoculture or single culture of ivy growing in a long flat area, you can do a fun thing we call making an ivy burrito. So if you have some friends that are willing to help, and you can kind of roll it like in the picture here, and cut some of the roots or pull some of the roots as you go. But we like to say, like, try to keep the pulled ivy off the ground because it can really easily resprout. And that's why it's important to get as much of the roots up as possible, because even, a fragment of root can grow another plant. So Himalayan blackberry, that was our #1 invasive plant that most people watching today have. This has been a battle for me in my own yard. But we actually have a native species of blackberry that's more of a low growing ground cover too. Pictured here is the Himalayan blackberry, and this is the invasive one, as well as evergreen blackberry. And there's really sharp thorns. They do have some delicious berries, but the birds also love to grab those and then spread them all throughout the area. So one of the reasons we want to get rid of the blackberry is that it doesn't have, it just creates a monoculture. So it's, all the food all at one time. So it's better to have kind of a mix of species in the area. It's also not great at stabilizing our shorelines. It has, if you've dug out a blackberry root, it has one thick taproot, and instead of that fibrous root system like we saw a few slides back. For blackberry, we typically cut and mow it, and then we're either gonna, leave about 1 foot of the cane left, so you know where to dig out the root balls. And then you can either manually dig that out or apply just a little bit of herbicide right after you cut it. We call it like the cut dab method, just to the top of the cane, or let it regrow a little bit and resprout, and then just spray that new foliage. So Japanese knotweed, we had a few people that have that here. We actually have 3 varieties of invasive knotweed in our area. And this is a really invasive weed that likes to take over our shoreline areas. And a big issue with this is we can't mow it. So we don't want to mow this ever, because every about 3-inch piece of the plant could resprout a whole new Japanese knotweed plant. So if you imagine that happening, if we were to mow down in our riparian areas and then it flows downstream, it can establish new Japanese knotweed plants around the way. So this is the one where we say chemical control is really the best option. And if you do have this on your property, I know King County Noxious Weeds has some resources available to possibly help you control that. So we have a couple woody invasive plant species as well. So English cherry laurel and then English holly. And these woody plants can really take over if you're not careful. And just cutting them down can also result in multiple stems regrowing, which can be a huge headache. And then you can see the shine on some of these leaves, the really waxy leaves. Spraying herbicide directly on it it's not usually as effective. So we like to use kind of an herbicide injection method, or if we do cut it, painting the herbicide directly on the cut stump, and then leaving the wood to die and act as a natural wildlife habitat. So these were just really a few examples of some of the most common weeds in our area, but there's a lot more information on the King County Noxious Weeds website. And we'll also email you a link in the resource packet at the end of the webinar that addresses a lot of the other weeds that we didn't get to talk about today. So step one was removing those invasive weeds, figuring out what we have and removing them. Now we're moving on to step two, which is controlling for erosion, which can be really important, especially on slopes or areas right next to creeks or streams. Because we said, an important part of streams is they're helping to transport water and sediment. So we want to establish some temporary erosion control while our plants are getting established and forming those root systems that are going to knit together nicely. So in this photo, we have a couple different things that we use. So the long blanket of coir fabric or jute is erosion control fabric, and we'll cut into that and plant into that as well. And we want something that's going to break down over time. And then we have some straw wattles on the steep slope as well. That's going to stop some of that surface water from carrying the sediment down the slope. So now that we've controlled invasives and controlled for erosion, we get to move on to planting. But before we go out and buy any plants, we really want people to become a detective. So figuring out the soil and light and water and any other special considerations of your site to make sure you're, figuring out which plant is right for your property. Because you're really the expert of your property. And so taking all of these things into consideration, figuring out what your soil's like, is it rocky and well draining, or do you see a lot of pooling of water that's stagnant over time? These will help decide what plants will thrive in your area and require the least amount of maintenance over time. So some of the guidance on what common plant recommendations mean are, for full sun, we say that's really a minimum of 6 hours of direct sunlight. Part sun is that 3 to 6 hours direct sunlight. Part shade is more emphasis on shade in the afternoon, and then full sun is that less than 3 hours of direct sunlight. And some plants really prefer more sun, some like more shade, and some are generalists. So as you're kind of figuring out which areas of your site have different conditions, as far as soil availability and sun availability, it can be really helpful to do just whatever kind of basic map. This is, a fancier map we've done for one of our restoration projects, but it can be as simple as kind of drawing a map of your property or using a site like King County iMap to launch the map, zoom in, type in your address, and show the aerial shots like we saw of Renton earlier. You can zoom in even closer and get to see, your specific property printed out and, draw with Sharpie on it and kind of map out the different areas. Some other considerations before you put any plants in the ground is to think about what's below the soil. So 811, calling 811 or going to call811.com. It's a really great free service that's performed just within a couple days to tell you, if there's any gas, sewer, water, electric lines, or cable lines that you should be aware of underground before you start digging. And then thinking about any vines and making sure we're not planting any tall trees or aggressive vines underneath power lines. And then also thinking through not wanting to top trees. So as we said, power lines, this is an image of a tree that was topped and then has to have a bunch of other leaders come up. So thinking through in advance, what the grown height is going to be of the plant that you're putting in. And then also being wary of any thicket forming hedges. So here we have a bunch of roses planted right next to a path that need to be pruned over time. So the less maintenance we need to do over time, the better. So if we can plant those in further or plant, trees and shrubs that are going to just stay in one place and not spread out. And we do say some pruning may be needed over time, but we really recommend that you only prune those weak, dead, broken, or conflicting branches. And the best time to do that is kind of the late winter, early spring before they start budding out. And then plant placement. So before you've purchased them, thinking about what you want where. And we always like to recommend, creating a layered transition between any lawn areas that you want to maintain and the buffer. So here we have a picture of some Konikanik, kind of as that low level ground cover then sword fern, and then transitioning into the taller plants. So that can be a really visually appealing way to use native species to create more of a landscaped transition into the buffer. And then also thinking through if you want to maintain any view corridors, paths, or different recreational areas in the landscaped area. So here we have kind of a pathway through the middle of the buffer to make sure we're leaving access. And I know some people like to leave view corridors, so kind of mapping out where you want to be able to see the water on your property. All right, so next let's look at the different types of plant material you can buy. So we have potted, bare root, plugs, and live stakes that we'll just quickly talk about. And there are different pros and cons and planting windows for each of these types of plant stock. So potted plants, those are the most readily available species. This is what you see in most nurseries. And they have probably the best survival rate too. And they're hardy and good for transporting, or if you want to buy them and not plant them right away, they can sit on site for a little while. Some of the cons of potted plants are that they are the more expensive, or the most expensive of the ones we'll talk about. Being sure to mix up that potting soil and native soil when you put it in the ground, so it doesn't stay in its little comfort zone and wrap its roots around. And if you're, have a large property and are walking out a long ways, this can be a lot harder to transport than some of our other plant types. So bare root plants and plugs are the cheapest, like a really cheap option, and they are adapted to our native soils and really easy to transport because they don't have that soil attached to the bottom. Some of the cons of bare roots and plugs, though, are there's a narrow planting window, usually about January through March is when they're pulled from the ground and made available. And they're usually only sold in larger bundles, so like 10 to 20. And there's only a few limited suppliers. So we'll talk about it a little bit later on where you can get some of these plants right now. And there can be more skill needed to plant these. So one common thing we see is a lot of J rooting, where people have just put the plant in the ground and the roots go up. And so trying to avoid that is something to just be aware of. And there can be some potential for higher mortality rates with these as well. So another plant stock option is live stake. And this is really great for wet sites or areas where you don't want to disturb the soil because you're just pushing them in. So we use a lot of live stakes kind of right as the first couple rows of plants right next to the water when we're restoring some stream areas. Some cons of this, though, are that there are only limited species that can be used as live stakes, like willow and red osier dogwood and cottonwood. So they can also have, a higher mortality rate. So our planting window is listed here. So really we're thinking in Western Washington, we want to be planting a lot of our containers, stakes, and bare roots when the rain's happening. So we want to help them get established before a dry summer. And then for wetland areas, we want to plant kind of right at the end of the dry season, right before the rains start, where we can still access our wetland area and we're not compressing some of the wet soils. So now let's dive into what we're going to plant. And we're going to highlight just a few native plant all-stars, which are the easiest growing guys that are going to provide a lot of bang for your buck. And we'll go through kind of 3 general categories. So our wet-loving plants, our dry-loving plants, and generalists. And the generalists that can really survive in a multitude of conditions. So think through that like planting plan or map that you're creating in your head already about the different places on your property, and think about what you might want to add for some of those different areas. So to start with our moisture-loving plants, this is one of my favorites. It's the Western Red Cedar, or Thuja plicata, and we'll list the common and the Latin name for each of these. So this is an evergreen tree all-star, and it was known by the indigenous peoples of the area as the tree of life. And it really thrives in the moist to wet conditions with partial shade. So the rot-resistant wood was used to make dugout canoes, baskets, clothing, and a variety of tools. And we say this tree is really like a restoration workhorse. It can grow large. So if you have the space, it's really an excellent condition, or an excellent addition. Pacific Ninebark, or Physocarpus capitatus, can survive in those wet, moist areas and can even take some ponding or flooding. It doesn't like to dry out totally. And this plant has really beautiful white flowers and pink blossoms shown in some of the pictures here. And it can really add beauty to your garden and be a valuable resource for wildlife. And the plant was actually called Ninebark because of its unique peeling bark that people believed grew in 9 layers. So even though that's untrue, the name stuck and the bark is really incredible. So Pacific Ninebark is kind of that wet area, can tolerate shade or sun. And then red osier dogwood or Cornus sericea. This plant really prefers the moist soils and can grow in some drier spots as well. And this is one of those plants that we said could be live staked right next to the creek. And it forms, the flowers are slightly more open clusters. And the real cool thing about this is the red stem. So it has a really bright red stem that looks beautiful in the winter. So as you're thinking about how the plants will look over time in your garden, this is a good one to consider. So this one likes wet sites and sunny or shady, but the more sun it gets, the more water it needs. Those are just a few wet loving plants. Now we'll talk about a couple dry soil loving plants. So the first one is Nuka Rose or Rosa Nakana. And this can grow up to 9 feet tall, and it's a really, really robust rose. It has beautiful pink flowers that can be good for pollinators. And it does spread, so it will rapidly establish an area and take over. That picture earlier where we showed kind of a plant encroaching onto a pathway was this one. So just think through where you want to put this one. It can form a natural hedgerow or kind of a natural fence and act as a barrier for people or wildlife. And this likes to be able to get a fair amount of sun, so dry soils and sunny conditions. Mock orange, Philadelphus lewisii, likes those dry, rocky soils and some moderate sunshine. And the flowers on this are a huge draw. They're very fragrant and great for pollinators. So you can definitely smell one of these if you have them in your yard. And then red flowering currant, rabies sanguinium. I have a lot of these in my yard. I love them. They're beautiful pink flowers. And they like the dry, open, wooded areas, rocky slopes. So, dry, medium amount of sunshine. And the flowers do a really great job attracting pollinators. So we get a lot of hummingbirds that come into our yard because they love the flowers on these red flowering currant. Tall Oregon grape or Mahonia aquifolium. This also loves the open, dry sites. Some people can confuse this with English ivy. You can see kind of the shiny, pointed leaves. One of the distinguishing factors between this is that it has leaflets, not individual leaves. And this doesn't grow into the tall trees. It can grow somewhat tall, but it's not tree forming the same way. And they have these beautiful clusters of yellow flowers and the bright blue berries. And then Konikanik is a good dry loving ground cover. So this is an evergreen plant, so it'll have leaves on it throughout the year. And this was in the picture we showed earlier of the first transition from lawn that we showed Konikanik and then sword fern. This is a good ground cover that knits together. And it likes sandy, well-drained soils. And you can also see it sometimes tucked into landscaping between large rocks because it'll drape down nicely and create a really beautiful aesthetic. So we sometimes recommend this as a good post-restoration plant once you've got some things established, because it can be somewhat hard to weed between. So now we'll dive into some of the generalists. So we're saying, unlike the koala bear, who specializes in only eating eucalyptus, the next plants are more like the raccoons, which we also have in some of our urban areas, that eat everything. And these plants can grow well, the generalists will grow well in a variety of conditions.
Nikki,
Someone that you may...
We've got about 5 minutes. Sorry.
Perfect. Thanks, Marin. So vine maple, Acer circinatum, is a small tree that you can see kind of growing in a lot of understories in some of our forested areas. And this grows to be about 12 to 20 feet high, which makes them really perfect for small spaces like gardens. And they prefer moist soils and generally a mix of sun and shade. And then in fall and winter, you can see the leaves here are turning orange. They can become that really vibrant orange and red. And actually, the more sun it gets, the redder the leaves become. And then in the little picture here, you can see some of the red and white flowers, which are a favorite of some of our native bees as well. So osoberry or Indian plum, Omlaria cerasiformis, is another small shrub, small tree. And this is one of the first plants to leaf out in the spring, and one of the first to have flowers. So I always love seeing this in some of our urban areas because, you know, spring is near, and it's a really valuable food source for animals as we're thinking about creating beneficial wildlife habitat on our property. We'd love to have those early on flowers and berries in our area for the wildlife. And this is, yeah, a generalist. It flexes between kind of wet to dry, sun to shade. So it's a pretty safe choice. And then snowberry, Symphorocarpus albus, it can tolerate dry to moist soils with moderate sun. And a cool thing about this plant is that the leaves have all different shapes and sizes, which makes them a really interesting plant to look at. These will also form thickets and can be a great habitat for birds and mammals. And they have these beautiful white berries that linger on late into the season because they're not as palatable to a lot of the birds. So it can make a really beautiful winter plant as well. So we only went through a few of the different plants, but King County Go Native website is a great resource of native plant species. So you can, you know, click on which ones you're interested in and kind of create your own custom native plant list. And there's a lot of how-to articles with the native plants as well. So we've kind of talked about which plants you might be interested in. So now we'll cover where to buy them. So we'll send out a resource guide at the end of this. You'll get a link to a Dropbox, and in that guide, there'll be a native plant nursery list, and then also information about King Conservation District's native bare root plant sale. So step 4, kind of in our restoration process, we like to do this on a lot of our sites that we're not, you know, where we're not planning to water, is mulch. So it can be a great way to retain nutrients and moisture, especially as the plants are small and getting established, as well as we saw it in our invasive control section earlier, as a way to suppress some small non-aggressive weeds. So we say we want about 4 to 6 inches of mulch, and you can either do, like pictured here, sheet mulch, or you can do rings. So picture a donut around each of these plants in blue tubes. And it can be a great way to help keep your plants and the soil around it nice and moist. And then some free mulch that a lot of us have right now and maybe raking up are leaves. And we love to think of this as free mulch and free erosion control and good insect habitat. So we definitely encourage you to leave the leaves if you can, or to kind of tuck them in lieu of mulch. And then we say steps 5 through 105 of the restoration process is maintenance. So this is a really crucial, important step in restoration. And for our sites, you know, we maintain them for about 5 years at least, and then we keep an eye on them for about 15. So it's really good to monitor and control for any invasive species that regrow. And then replanting if survivorship falls below 80% of the new plants you've established. And then also replacing mulch over time. And then, you know, if you're interested, if you want to irrigate, we say maybe for the first 1 or 2 years, the small plants you can irrigate during the really hot months, but being sure to water, you know, infrequently and deeply to encourage those roots to continue to grow down nice and deep so they don't get accustomed to that surface water. And then being sure not to overwater them. And really with the right planning and maybe a few friends to help you out, you can start off with something for a shoreline area that looks like this. And then just 2 years later, have some nice plants established. And so we just wanted to mention too, like KCD is a resource for you and we're here to help. So we offer technical assistance. If you live on a stream, river, lake, or wetland in King County, you could be eligible for free technical assistance from one of our planners. And we'll have a survey at the end for you to fill out if that's something you're interested in learning more about. We also offer 5 free soil tests to properties in King County to help you know what is growing, what's in the soil in your area. If you're considering adding fertilizer or different things to that, knowing the quantity you would need for what you're trying to grow. And we have bare root native plant sale that we offer annually, as well as, I know in the initial registration page, we have some people that live on farm properties and forested properties. So we do have farm planning services and small lot forest planning services and technical assistance as well. So the resource link you'll get at the end of this presentation is going to have an evaluation survey, and we would really appreciate your feedback. This is a really brief overview of a lot of, Restoration 101. So if there's more information you wish we would have provided, please indicate it there. And we'll also have a link to our Dropbox, so you can download all of the slides you see here, as well as the invasive plant best management practices, more information about native plants and the best habitat for them, as well as that native plant nursery list and more information about our programs and services. And we do have a couple other upcoming events. I've kind of alluded to it, but our plant sale actually just launched, pre-orders just launched this week. So we still have a lot of plants available. And if you're interested in this, you would place your order now, and then pickup will be at the Tukwila Community Center on March 5th and 6th. And this is the place where you can get those bare root plants, where we said are pretty cheap, sold in bulk, and can be easy to transport across your project site. We also have a virtual farm tour next weekend. And then we have some webinars that are going to dive in a lot more just to all the different types of native plants that we're selling at our plant sale. So those are coming up in December and January. Great, so thanks you guys for listening in. We have some time for questions. So I'd like to take a couple questions. Marin, if you want to read them from the chat, any that we haven't answered yet, now would be the time. And then if you have any questions, please type them into the chat as well. And I think we have Ashley Allen, who's our urban shoreline planner, who will be helping answer some of the questions too.
So far we only have the one question, and Ashley just actually answered it. They were asking about what plants would be best to use if they have elk. And Ashley has said, mostly you're just going to try to protect whatever plants you do use using cages. So
Great. Yeah, elk can definitely be a tough one. Yeah, something we do, you saw some of the blue tubes we have on our plants. We also do use metal cages that we'll put usually around the tree species. And then that's where coming back through and replanting is really crucial. So monitoring kind of for that 80% survival, and some trial and error, which is, it can be nice to use some bare root plants that are a little lower cost, and try a few different species and see which ones the elk like less, and then use more of those. Great. I'm seeing another question. In some areas of our stream, we have a lot of big leaf maple near the creek and very few plants under them. Is this good for the stream? It actually is good. Yeah, big leaf maples are one of our native maple trees. And, it's nice to have kind of a palette of different species, but they're doing a good job providing a lot of shade. Those don't live as long as our evergreen trees. So something we like to do is plant kind of the next level of what's going to take over as those big leaf maples, die off and drop their limbs down and break down over time. We want that next level of evergreen trees there ready to kind of take their place.
And it says, should we allow all poplar seedlings to develop into trees?
Ashley, do you have a good answer for that one? I'm not sure if you can unmute yourself. About the poplar seedlings?
Can I get the question one more time? I was still responding to Anne here.
Should they allow all poplar seedlings to develop into trees?
That's, I think it's really going to depend on how closely those poplar seedlings are coming up together. Obviously, if they're very densely establishing over time, that would require some limbing. So that's a consideration. Typically when we're planting trees, we're planting them at least 18 or 20 feet apart. So if they're growing more closely than that, I would probably start to thin them out.
Great. Okay. And now another question is, I just got another one. Sorry, my questions are moving. It's talking about jute fabric, and they were informed to not use it, but we had just said to use it. Is there one one to follow.
I know it can be an issue, and Ashley, feel free to chime in too. Depending if you get a lot of, like if your stream is really flashy or is going to flood that area, that might be a consideration for whether you would want to install that. Any other considerations, Ashley, for using that erosion control fabric or not? And we'll also keep a track of all these questions too and be able to respond. I know some people are sending me some questions directly, so if we don't get a chance to answer them today, we'll definitely address them and send out answers to the whole group. So we have a question too, recently acquired goats to help clear some of the blackberries. Thoughts on ground covers or large area coverings to put in those newly exposed soil areas while working towards long-term solutions? So any of the ones we've listed too, you'll want to consider, and then figure out if you want to kind of fence out those goats too, because you know they'll eat just about anything. So as you're looking to clear the blackberry and then reestablish some other plants, I know something that some people like to use, you know, the Nuka Rose also spread kind of similarly, but you'd really have to figure out what's the right plant for your place. Let's see.
If we go back up a little
Yeah.
ways, somebody says, suggestions for plants to have great roots for erosion control and active uptake of water in the winter and spring, like not winter dormant plants.
Yeah, so we really like evergreen trees. So if you're looking for more of those evergreen species, those are going to create the deepest root systems and help take up water. I think like a mature Douglas fir tree can take up something like 200 gallons of water a day, which is just crazy to me. So Jeff, I hope that answers your question.
I'll also add on to that, Nikki.
Yeah.
So we're looking for things that don't go into winter dormancy, because usually with slope stability concerns, I would recommend a few deciduous shrub species, like salmonberry. You know, it spreads rhizominously. It's a very aggressive spreader, so it does a good job of quickly spreading to help stabilize the soil. And other spreading species like snowberry, and oftentimes, you know, roses, some of our native roses like Nuka Rose. Especially if you have a drier slope, that's when you would use Nuka Rose. But that being said, so apart from trees, yeah, like Nikki said, they do a great job of helping to take up water, but also sword fern. If we're just looking at, you know, smaller ground cover species, sword fern is an excellent plant at helping to stabilize slopes and really does a good job of helping water to infiltrate into the soil.
That's crazy. There's some photos that show kind of the cross section of roots and sword ferns, and they go feet down into the soil and really do help kind of knit the soil in.
Somebody has a sort of follow-up if we're talking about evergreen trees. They're asking, how closely can they be planted to a stream? The cedars in particular.
Yeah, cedars. So I mean, they like to get their feet wet. I've seen them right up adjacent to creeks before, but you know, sometimes it's just they can tolerate that seasonally. So if there's higher, you know, of course, higher water levels in the winter versus the summer, then you can oftentimes see them right up next to creek systems. So I think it would just kind of depend. You can try it out. Usually, you know, we're setting them at least a few feet back, but definitely would stick to the cedars with that. Douglas fir, you know, that species in particular tends to like it a little bit drier. So with the cedars, yeah, you can try planting it right next to, right near your creek. I would just say if you know it's a wetland and there's going to be standing water, then I would not plant it where it will be just saturated completely throughout the winter.
I'm just going to keep going on the cedar path. Can we replace willow with cedar? It says they have a couple that are causing damage due to breaking. They're very large, but they have their roots in the water.
Well, I mean, it's willow. They're great because they are, they adapt well to disturbance, and oftentimes in stream sides there can be a lot of disturbance. We all remember this past winter when we had some pretty large flood events. So they're good at that. However, there are definitely some big trade-offs there. So willow, it is shorter lived. So it's not, in terms of stream health, it's not providing that long-term shade like cedars would. And of course, willow, it is deciduous versus evergreen. So you're only getting kind of that late spring into early fall shade on the creek system. And then in addition to that, I mean, they're just not reaching the same height as our cedars do. Willows, depending on the species, I mean, they can top out at 30 feet tall. Some are smaller. Sitka willow tends to be a little bit smaller than, let's say, Pacific willow. So you definitely have to consider those trade-offs there. And do know that, cedar, it is an upright conifer. But willow, it's going to be a lot denser. It's going to be harder to access your creek if you have willows, because they do tend to drop their limbs, and then those limbs can actually start growing new willows. So you do have to watch out for that.
We have time for one more question.
Let's see. So there's two questions I feel like are sort of similar. One is talking about, is adding rocks and logs in the creek help with the health of the creek? And then somebody else says, when a tree is wind blown down, uprooted, is it okay to remove and replant? So it's still kind of that same woody debris question.
Yeah. Do you want to take that, Ashley?
Yeah, let's start with the downed tree that's been uprooted. Yeah, I mean, normally if it's fallen on its own and it has not fallen into a creek, typically I would say yes, but my caveat there is you really should probably reach out to your local city planner and check what the code is there, just to make sure. I'd say if it was, standing redwood, definitely there'd be some restrictions on what you can do if this tree is in a critical area. Once it's downed, maybe, but I think it's just safest to reach out to your local city planner and check the code. And of course, if you're an unincorporated, look into the county code, King County Code. Let's see, what was our other question?
Adding rocks or logs to help with the health of the creek.
Yeah. So yeah, large woody debris. So downed wood in creeks, of course, it's great for salmon habitat in natural systems. It's adding to stream complexity, which salmon need. It's creating refuge pools for salmonids to hide and kind of rest in. It's creating substrate for what we call benthic macroinvertebrates, or aquatic insects, to live on. And of course, salmon eat these aquatic insects. However, again, there's many codes about what you can do below the ordinary high water mark of a waterway, like a stream. So if we're talking about intentionally putting in wood, then oftentimes there are regulations around that and permitting processes related to that. If you have a tree that just happens to fall into the creek and you leave it there, okay, sure, as long as it's not, causing flooding or issues downstream. However, going in and intentionally placing things, that gets a little trickier. So again, I just have to say, look into your local code and contact your local planner.
Great, thank you. And then if you have any questions, please reach out to me. I have my email address and work cell phone number posted here. And then you can also visit our website as well. So feel free to email me, send me any questions. Great, so thank you for joining us. We really appreciate you all spending your Saturday morning learning about native plants and restoration.